As a teacher in the 2020 pandemic of March, I was at home a lot and I decided that I needed an outlet, something other than the news and something other than the difficulties of school at that time. So I decided to do something completely different and completely step out of my comfort zone and pursue entrepreneurship. And this was significant to me because I have been in academia my whole life. So through my studies of entrepreneurship, I came across this quote. And the quote said, "Becoming an entrepreneur will show you who you really are. It will expose your every weakness and fortify your every strength." So naturally, as a teacher, I began to ask myself, how? In what way does entrepreneurship expose our weaknesses as educators and also fortify our strengths? And then the next question was, in what way does entrepreneurship affect Gen Z students who are my dominant audience as a high school teacher? And as you know, Gen Zers have a very unique identity all of their own. And so I asked myself, is there a connection between teaching my students and entrepreneurship? So later on, I want to share with you an experience of a massive failure that I had as a new entrepreneur that occurred in my classroom. And from there, I want to teach you some ways, 4 specific ways, that entrepreneurship can be used in your classes as an educator if you're a teacher, and then also the ways that we can utilize entrepreneurship to not only expose the weaknesses of Gen Z, but also to strengthen the core of who they are. So one day, to illustrate, I went into my classroom and I told my students, I said, guys, I had a massive failure as an entrepreneur yesterday. Would you be interested in learning what happened? And my students, they said, yes, we would love to know what happened. And so I told them, I said, well, a person contacted me and they wanted me to give a seminar or a speech to other teachers in the Philippines. And as we were working out the details and ironing everything out, the director of the program asked me a question that I had never been asked before. He said, what do you charge? What is your rate? What is your fee? And that was a question that I had never been asked before because all my life, everyone has told me what I was worth, $5 an hour, $15 an hour, $20 an hour, and so on. So I asked my students, I said, do you guys know what the going rate is for a speaker to deliver a seminar? They said no, and I looked at my students and I said, neither do I. So I said, why don't we do what any great class would do? Why don't we just Google it and find out? So we Googled it, and we discovered that the average speaker, they make somewhere between $500 and $2,500 per engagement. And I cringed a little, my heart sunk a little lower because I knew what I had charged, and it was nowhere near that rate. So then I asked my students, I said, do you guys know the host and comedian of Family Feud, Steve Harvey? And they were like, oh yes, we know him. So I said, well, I actually saw in one of his YouTube videos how much he charges to speak at an engagement or to do an appearance. And I said, do you know how much Steve Harvey charges? How much do you think that is? And they weren't really sure. So I said, well, in one of his YouTube videos, Steve Harvey said that he charges $100,000 per engagement. And at that time, my students, their eyes got so big, they were not really surprised because Steve Harvey is a celebrity. But then I told them, I said, so for me, in my case, I said, I could have charged anywhere between $500 to do this speaking gig for the teachers in the Philippines, somewhere between $500 and Steve Harvey. And they all laughed, and I said, do you guys know what I charged? How much money I accepted to do this gig for? And I hung my head in a little bit of shame and embarrassment, and I said, this is how much I charged, $70. So I looked at my students, and I said, truthfully, guys, I really don't know why I said that number. It just came out. So maybe you can help me understand why I just picked an arbitrary number like 70 to do this speaking engagement for. And I put them in groups. We did a turn and talk. And if you're not an educator, a turn and talk is just where you talk to your neighbor, groups of 2 to 3, and you share your thoughts and opinions before we come back to whole group. So when we came back to whole group, I asked my students, I said, guys, why do you think that I did this? Because I truly, in the moment, I didn't really know. So when we came back to whole group, I invited some students to share their responses. And what I told them in that moment was, guys, after some thinking, the real reason why I charged only $70 was simply because for my whole life, I've undervalued myself and I over-deliver. That's what happens all the time. And it's in the most important moments that I do this. So then I turned to them and I said, what can you learn from this experience that I've had as a new entrepreneur? What can you learn that will affect your life in a positive way? So I sent them on their way again to do another turn and talk, to share their thoughts. And as I was listening to their conversations, there were some pretty insightful comments that they had. And so when we returned to whole group, I invited a few students to share their thoughts. And this is what some of them had to say. One student said, never undercut yourself. Pretty smart. The next student said, charge more money. Most definitely. We'll do that next time. Then another student then said, ask what the pay range is for their speakers, something that never even occurred to me to do. So very wise student there. Then another student said, well, you're like a little less than Steve Harvey, so instead of charging 100 grand, just charge like 80,000 next time. So that was a lot of fun. And I looked at my students and I said, guys, all of your thoughts are very valid. But there's one thing that I want you to take from this experience, and that is this: never undervalue yourself. When I look back on that experience, I think about how the organization, they got a lot of great trainings, they got a lot of amazing teaching tools, and most importantly, they got my time, all for $70. And I think about that, and I want you guys to understand that it's important to never undervalue your teachings, your talent, and your time. And I said, when you're smart, or when you negotiate, be smart when you're doing that, because if you charge a higher rate, of course, you can always negotiate up or down based on the value of your services. That was a lesson that I had learned. But in addition to that, it's very hard to negotiate up when you've already settled for less, if that makes sense. So my students, they took that lesson to heart, and undoubtedly that will be a lesson that I hope that will serve them well throughout life. So that begs the question. Once we had that experience in class, I started to ask myself, okay, what does entrepreneurship reveal to us about Gen Z? And how can we as teachers and mentors utilize the powers of entrepreneurism to strengthen the core of who they are and also bring meaningful experiences, more meaningful experiences, and practical value to our lessons? So I'm going to break this down into 4 core beliefs of Gen Zers. The first is confidence. Gen Zers are typically described as being risk-averse. Their teachers will oftentimes describe them this way, and this is a very common perception of Gen Z. Of course, it's not everyone. However, if a Gen Zer, in my own experience, if a Gen Zer is risk-averse, typically that's because of cancel culture. What this means is that Gen Zers, more than really any other generation, they understand the fear and how difficult it is to put your face out there for fear of being rebuked, criticized, or even canceled. They understand that better than anyone else. But with you as their guide, as the teacher, you set the example and you help them navigate complex situations, just as we did that day in class. And as a result of that, they will start to see their confidence building. And as their confidence grows, the Gen Zers will then, in turn, get closer and closer to finding their real purpose. The next area, with regards to Gen Z, is empathy. Gen Zers are also often cited as being the most empathetic generation or the most tolerant generation that has ever existed. And this is mostly in part due to them having very diverse backgrounds and a lot of complexity when it comes to their core influences in life. However, empathy is not just about diversity. It's more than diversity, and it's also more than just tolerance. Empathy is about building connections with others. It's about understanding the variety of perspectives that exist in the world, and instead of jumping to worst-case scenario and canceling someone for having a different opinion or a different viewpoint, we embrace those differences. Empathy is also about guiding someone, offering them sound and wise advice to get through difficult situations. It's also, despite any challenges, it's communicating thoughtfully and with poise and with polish. So when I explain to my students and I talk to other teachers about this subject, I teach my students this lesson, and you as the teacherpreneur will also do the same as you start to explore your own journey in entrepreneurship, and that is this. There is no cutting corners. There is no just taking the L, as many of my students will say. There is no embracing the path of least resistance when it comes to connecting with people, empathy. And there are no shortcuts when it comes to building the reputation that you want and that you can be proud of to attract the type of success that you want to have. There is no shortcut to that. The next aspect of Gen Z. It's abundantly clear that Gen Zers are facing very unique and challenging and significant situations in their lives, some of them being the 24-hour bombardment of clickbait, negative news. Also, there's the weight and pressure of social media for validation and status in life. These are very unique, especially to Gen Z. However, with entrepreneurship teaches you that to succeed in life, you have to take a leap of faith. You can't allow the cancelers, the rebukers, and the criticizers to take control of your life. However, to take a leap of faith, I myself, all of us as teachers, all of us as students, and regardless of whatever path we're on, in order to take a leap of faith, we all have to become the authority of our own life. And to become the authority of our own lives, we have to do one thing, and that is we have to learn to value ourselves and what we do. The last aspect or core aspect of Gen Zers is motivation. When Gen Zers are looking for guidance, support, direction in their lives, a lot of Gen Zers, not all, but a lot of Gen Zers will oftentimes turn to the very first source that they come across for that help and direction. And that can mean many different things to many different people. They might turn to their parents, they might turn to their teachers, they might turn to their coaches, or they might turn to a device as a coping mechanism. And what happens is that these sources that they turn to for guidance and wisdom, they become what's known as our primary influencers. The primary influencers, they mold our mindset and our level of motivation. What's particularly complex for Gen Z, though, and is particularly unique to them, is that the core influencers of their lives oftentimes conflict with one another, which is unique to Gen Zers, and it was not always this way, especially for boomers, Xers, and millennials. What I mean by that specifically, that they conflict with one another, is that you'll see this in today's world. Many times what a teacher says is in direct conflict with what a parent says. What a parent says is oftentimes in direct conflict with what social media says. So oftentimes these core influences in our life, they are in direct conflict with one another. And it can be very difficult to navigate a complex situation when you've got 4 different people or 4 different things telling you all sorts of different information. However, becoming an entrepreneur is so powerful for Gen Zers, in particular when it comes to navigating complex situations. And this is because it helps them to find a core group of individuals that have a similar vision, that have a similar path in life. And those individuals, because they share that one aspect in common, they can uplift each other, they can guide each other, especially during challenging circumstances, rather than having the Gen Zer reach out for hollow, conflicting, and empty wisdom. So to conclude, I advocate that teachers become entrepreneurs as well in their own classrooms and outside of that. Because what will happen is this. Both teachers and students, they will step outside of the academic bubble, the one that I was trapped in for a long time. Additionally, students will no longer choose the pragmatic solution or the self-serving solution like, oh, I'm just going to take the L or take the path of least resistance. They won't do that anymore. They won't take the pragmatic solutions or accept that as a viable alternative because they will become invested in bettering themselves because of you, because of what you're doing in the classroom to train them. Additionally, integrity will become the foundation of all the decisions that are made both in and outside of the classrooms. And why is this important? Integrity and authenticity? Because organizations and businesses that we all support, but especially Gen Zers, the organizations and companies and businesses that they support, those organizations create communities. They also build trust. It's not just about creating a great product anymore. You've got to do all three to win over, especially a Gen Zer. So, entrepreneurship, in addition to that, it motivates us to take ownership of our own lives. And we do that because we start now understanding that the impact that we have in life is directly proportional to the belief systems that we have set in our head. Lastly, entrepreneurship teaches Gen Zers to value the successes and the sacrifices of those that came before them. And it also teaches them the respect that they need for the work ethic and the effort that it takes, not just to support themselves, but also to build a life. Thank you so much.